Hi everyone, we're moving on with pedigree charts today. And when we do that, I'm just going to start by introducing two different types of traits that we're going to look at, called autosomal and sex-linked traits. We're going to focus on autosomal traits today. But we're really going to use pedigree charts to start looking at the inheritance of different traits and conditions. Now this lesson really kind of brings a lot of what we've done before in. So we're going to start using Punnett squares again, just kind of, the standard dominant and recessive ones. So it might be worth having your notes available to go through that, or if you're still unsure of those, maybe revisiting some of those topics again. Okay, so we're going to, over the next couple of lessons, look at two different types of traits or conditions that can be passed on. So the first are autosomal traits or conditions. You might remember the term autosome from when we looked at karyotypes. Autosomes are basically the first 22 pairs of chromosomes. That's what we call the autosomes. So they're kind of just, our standard chromosomes. These traits or conditions that we're going to look at are kind of dominant or recessive. And because these are the autosomes, their males and females are equally likely to inherit these alleles. Okay, this is in comparison to sex-linked traits or conditions. We're not going to look at those until the next lesson, but these are for certain traits or alleles for diseases that are carried on the sex chromosomes. Okay, so remember the sex chromosomes can be X or Y. So X-linked traits are carried on the X chromosome. Again, they can be dominant or recessive, and these can affect either males or females. So remember, males have an X and a Y chromosome, and females have two X chromosomes. Whereas Y-linked traits that are carried on the Y chromosome, again, can be dominant or recessive, but they only affect males because genetic females do not have a Y chromosome. These are less common. The Y chromosome is actually much smaller than the X chromosome, but we're going to focus on all of those in the next lesson today. We're really just looking at autosomal traits, but just jump into the worksheet and just explain, the difference between autosomal and sex-linked traits. Okay, when we're looking at pedigree charts, we can pick up certain patterns just by looking at a chart that help us determine if the trait that is being represented is dominant or recessive. And just remembering that, when we look at these, if something is coloured in, that indicates that whatever we're tracking is present, or if it's a disease, that this person is affected with that disease. If it's not coloured in, they don't have that trait or they're not affected by that disease. So with dominant traits, if one or both of the parents are homozygous dominant, that means all of the children will have that trait. Okay, so let's use the letter B. Now let's say this parent is homozygous dominant. It's shaded in because they have the trait, because it's a dominant trait. And even if this parent is heterozygous, all of the children would either be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Okay, so that's quite an easy one to follow. I mean, obviously, if this was a recessive trait, it would look the same. If both of the parents had it and it was recessive, then their children would all have it as well. If, for a dominant trait, both of the parents are heterozygous, so we've got heterozygous and heterozygous, they're both shaded in because they both have the trait, this child has the trait, so they could be homozygous dominant or they could be heterozygous, but it is possible to have an unaffected child, okay, because they could both pass on that recessive allele and you could end up with an unaffected offspring of parents that have the trait or the condition. When we look at recessive traits, we see different patterns. So again, like I said, if this was a recessive, you could get something that looks the same as this one on the left here for a recessive trait. If both of the parents were homozygous recessive, all of the children would also be homozygous recessive. But if we had two parents that are heterozygous for a recessive trait, that means, so let's say they're heterozygous, they don't have the trait. So they're not coloured in because they've only got one of that recessive allele. But they could have a child, again, that is homozygous recessive, meaning that that child will have the trait. Remember, we would call these individuals, if it's a recessive trait, they would be carriers. And we've said if you know all of that information, you could represent them like that. You could have them half shaded in. They don't have the trait or the condition, but they do have the allele for it. But in the examples you're going to look at today, it's not going to tell you if they're carriers, because I want you to start looking at these patterns to try and interpret what type of inheritance is happening. So I guess the key thing with you know, recessive conditions and traits is that you can see this kind of skipping a generation where the parents might not have it, but then the offspring can. All right, most of today's lesson is really working through some examples, and I don't want to go through them too much because I want to see how much you have understood, but I will kind of explain this one. Now, it doesn't really matter what the trait is for this example, okay? But you can actually tell a lot from this picture. Okay, we know that this is a female because it's a circle. We know that this is a male because it is a square. Now, whatever trait we're tracking here or whatever condition, this individual is affected. Okay, so they are shaded in. So that is an affected male. This individual 1-1 is an unaffected female. You could describe the phenotypes of each of these individuals, and that's something in one of the questions that I want you to do. Other things that we could figure out from this, I've given the genotype of this individual. Okay, so individual 1-1 is homozygous dominant. Now, because that we now know that not having the trait is dominant, that means we can assume, well, we know that this individual has to be homozygous recessive. Okay, if we know both of these genotypes, we could actually figure out what the genotypes of these individuals are as well. Okay, remember, both of these have the trait, so we also know what their genotype is. Okay, so I want you to go into question 2. I've kind of broken it down into individual questions and have a go at that. All right, we'll look at a particular example of a condition called Marfan syndrome, and this is a dominant condition. Okay, so I've told you that this is dominant, which means that these shaded individuals are either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Okay, for this particular individual, I've told you that they are homozygous dominant, and that will make sense with some of the examples, meaning anyone that's unaffected has to be homozygous recessive. Okay, so again, you could actually figure out the genotypes of all of these individuals, because now that I've told you what this one is, you could figure out the genotypes of all of the other individuals just with the information that you have there. Okay, so I'm not going to ask you to do all of them, but there will be a few that I want you to look at. Sometimes, remember, if you're looking at this individual, you might, that individual, the only genetic information you've got is their offspring, whereas if you are looking at this individual, you could be looking at their parents and also at their offspring. Okay, so you kind of need to look around a little bit to see what information you can get. All right, another example is cystic fibrosis. This is a recessive condition. Okay, so if someone does not have cystic fibrosis, they have at least one version of the dominant allele. To have cystic fibrosis, a person must have both versions of that recessive allele. Okay, so for example, this person would have to be homozygous recessive to have that condition. Okay, you can see here most of the pedigrees we've looked at just start with one set of grandparents or parents. Here we've got the parents for both of them, okay, for both individuals there. Now, if you just looked at this individual in relation to their parents, we wouldn't be able to tell whether the parents or that individual is heterozygous or homozygous dominant. But if we look at their offspring, that tells us a little bit more about the story. Okay, so from that offspring, we can actually figure out what that person's genotype is, and then also the genotype of both of their parents. Okay, so just go in and answer question 4. All right, I've put a challenge question in as well. If you have run out of time, that's absolutely fine. But if you are going all right and you're enjoying this, have a go at this challenge question. So this is showing the inheritance for lactose intolerance. Okay. Now with this, it's got a bit of a key down here. So anyone that's shaded in is lactose intolerant. Anyone that's not shaded is lactose tolerant. And then the people with the question marks, it's not known what they are. Okay, so have a go at some of those questions in the challenge question. But yeah, don't run too far over time with this. Thanks.